All right, guys, welcome back to yet another episode of Let's Assess Podcast. I'm here with AJ, and today we're going to talk about cameras, especially cameras in the backcountry for snowmobiling and some action sports stuff. So we're going to jump right into it.
I don't want to talk. How you try and press the kid and read it, you was soft. All
right, guys, welcome back. Ralphie's barking, and we are shooting a podcast. So I want to dive into cameras a little more. That's probably my number one question on Instagram is like, what are you filming with? Or I have a camera and it doesn't look good. And before we jump into that, a lot of it is because, like I've said over and over, as snowmobilers, this is kind of the only way that we're able to show other people what we do. A lot of people are going for, kind of trying to build a living off social media or just, get where snowmobiling isn't so expensive every year through sponsorship. So obviously content has almost everything to do with that, in my opinion. So we're going to jump right in and kind of talk about it. So,
yeah, welcome back, guys. As you can tell, we have a nice dirty trailer behind us. We actually snuck out and got a ride in this week.
Yesterday,
it was awesome. We got some snow, and we were able to sneak out midweek and had some fun. Got a little filming in. It was great.
Didn't have time to clean the trailer.
Yeah, didn't have time to get things really situated for this, but that's okay. So hopefully y'all are listening anyway.
Yeah. So, okay, let's jump right into it. So when it comes to getting a camera, and AJ's going to kind of somewhat interview me.
Yeah. Yeah, because I got a camera this year, and to be honest with you, like if it wasn't for Brent being able to help me sort through some of the one, getting a camera, two, getting a laptop to edit the film that you get on the camera to where it's of quality. Like if I didn't have him helping me through that, and there's no one really out there helping with the outdoor, this snowmobile type industry, it's such a fast moving object and so many objects moving fast with the snow that I never even would have put into consideration. I probably would have put, $10,000 into cameras and laptops before I would have got to where I'm even at now. And then I'm at a setup that's like right now I'm starting at a base level setup, I feel like, for snowmobiling. But there's so many aspects to it that I didn't understand. And I was asking Brent. So when I first started, I was gung ho and I was like, hey, what do you think of this camera? And he'd be like, man, it only shoots at 30 feet per second and it's just not gonna work. So that was something that stuck out to me really fast, was how much you could slow it down in the feet per second, right?
Frames per second. Yeah.
So
let's jump right into that. The first thing that I would say with people, and I talked about this in another podcast, a lot of it is budget.
Yeah.
But even with, there's a ton of videos out there where it's a contest between a professional videographer on an iPhone versus a beginner on a $50,000 Sony Red setup, and the professional with the iPhone will win. Yeah. And we always talk, it's so many people are like, man, if I had that camera, I could get that content. It's if I wiped all the settings out of my camera and just put it into a standard version, your iPhone footage would look a heck of a lot better than using a camera rig.
I'm at that point right now, guys. I have
it's
$6,000 into a camera and a laptop to edit, and I can't. I guess $7,000. And my iPhone looks better right now, so that's where I'm at.
Yeah, it's a learning curve, but I'm gonna go through a couple settings. I'm not gonna be able to get into every nuance of explanation type stuff on why I do what. I'll get into it a little bit, but I want to get into some settings that, for those of you that have cameras, whether they're, Sony, Canon, Nikon, whatever, this is kind of a baseline that I would start at and then work from there. Obviously, every camera is a little different, but this would give you somewhat of a good idea. And going back to when you're buying a camera, something that I think for snowmobilers is the biggest deal is frame rate, like AJ talked about. If you really want that buttery slow motion in 4K, you need to be aware that when you're buying a camera, you need a camera that shoots at 4K at 60. That way you could slow it down 50%, or a camera that shoots even more than that, like something like 120, that you could cut to 25%, and it wouldn't look glitchy. It would look smooth. So that's one thing. The second thing,
And before you get to your second thing, that's the thing about when you slow it down, like when you watch some of these videos of people, you can see how it like moves nice and glides through the frames. But if you slow down like a 30 frame per second camera to 50%, it'll just look like chop, 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 you know?
yeah, it's real glitchy. Like the snow is moving, like it's not like flowing. It's like going, stopping, because you don't have enough frames to make it smooth, basically, is what it is in layman's terms.
So, yeah, exactly.
So then the second thing that I would say is really important is, unless you're a really experienced camera guy, which you're probably not watching this if you are, I would say autofocus is probably the second biggest thing. Autofocus, when it comes to fast moving stuff, you got to think you can have the best camera in the world, but if it's not in focus, if your shots are not in focus, it's not going to pan out for you. It's going to look like trash. And that's why a lot of people can get better footage on iPhones than they can cameras, because when you're going to a lower aperture, it's harder to get things into focus, where with an iPhone, most of the time, unless you're adjusting that, it's shooting at a higher aperture, which means, I don't want to get too technical on it, but
that's a deep dive.
Like, I'm not going to talk about what the camera's doing, but what basically it's doing when it comes to the image is making your field of focus more, like, have more depth, if you will. So, like, for example, if I shot at a really low f-stop, my lens is going to be wide open. And a lot of like cinematographers like that because it's better with like lower light and stuff like that. And it just gives it look like, they call it blurry background, it's called bokeh, but it makes it look more cinematic. But the problem is you're shooting a snowmobile. So if you're at a really low f-stop, like 1.4, and your camera's tracking, it's going to track the snowmobile in focus, or maybe even just the front nose of the snowmobile in focus. And then the rider's going to be completely out of focus. And that kind of leads me into what lens you should get. The lower aperture, the better, because it just gives you more versatility, like an f2.8. That's great. The lens I recommended for AJ was a 24 to 105. That's the range. And then it goes down to f4. And the reason why I recommended that is it has, in the Sony line, it has stabilization in it. It has a broad range of focal length, so you can zoom in or be wide. I mean, you could even vlog on that lens if you had to, or zoom in and get someone coming out of the trees way up above you. And then f4, yeah, for like a cinematographer, that's not low enough, or maybe even a portrait photographer, that's not low enough. But for what we're doing, I never shoot at a super, super low f-stop because, like I said, your whole rider and whole snowmobile is not in focus. It's pulling focus, and like I was talking about, that depth of focus is so shallow that, you know, you got to think if you're shooting at a snowmobile, it picks up the nose, that nose is going to be crystal clear, but then going back at a very low f-stop, it's blurry.
Yeah, and guys, that's something that I was never aware of, and I was having a problem with my stuff, and I'm still having a problem with my stuff being clear. It turns out it's a computer problem that we got to figure out. But I was always in like f4 because I was like, I want this to be focused right on the sled. Well, it was never focusing on the whole image, and I was like catching trees, and like there's a whole list of things that I was doing wrong. But now I'm shooting at like f6, f7, something like that. And when I pass the camera to someone like my dad or Marcus even that isn't super familiar with cameras, I'll even bump it up to like f9 or something like that. Just that way they're for sure going to get a clear image of what's happening, not just, they don't have to be as precise with where they're aiming and everything like that. Cause that's super, super frustrating when you go up and you ride an entire day. You know, you're talking, you rode the entire day, you get a ton of footage, you come back and it's all blurry. That
kills you.
Yeah.
That kills you. So, okay, let's pick up from where I left off. Buying the camera, the lens, it's budget based. Do some research and see. I would look for 4K. I mean, that's really clear footage. I would look to go to a camera that you can get the frame rate as high as your budget can afford. 120 in 4K is really good. That's high enough in my opinion. some of these cameras, I mean, dude, you can spend a ton of money and there's a camera out there that does, and I'm sure there's more, but there's one that does 1,000 frames per second.
Jeez.
But that's not made for someone that's trying to learn how to work a camera. That's a really specialized camera. Anyway, so once you have the camera, I would go and start playing around with it. I want to give you baseline settings. I think this will help you guys out. What I would start with, dude, I mean, I'm just thinking like all this stuff, I could go into like literally shoot a podcast on every single one of these things. Cause I mean, you could talk about them for an hour, but, so f-stop, controlling how wide that lens is open, and all of this, depending on the camera you have, you're going to have to look it up, how to adjust f-stop on Sony A6400 or Canon R5 or whatever. But, I would run the f-stop around to start 5.6 to 7.1 maybe. I've been running it at 5.6 and I haven't had a problem. It looks crisp, it looks clear, and if you're in the shadows, it's not too dark of an image. So I would start at 5.6. If you're getting the front of the sled in focus and the back, or the rider's not in focus, then crank that up to maybe 7.1. So that's f-stop. ISO for beginners, I know this is contrary to popular belief, but to get it, the run and gun when you're going through shadows and then trees and then, sunny meadows and all that stuff, I would just leave your ISO in auto. And a lot of like cinematographers would be like, never leave it in auto, but I would, being honest, I would just leave it in auto. And then you got to watch ISO, because the more you crank the ISO up, and depending on how nice of a camera you have, you're able to crank it higher. What ISO is it's introducing artificial light basically to the image to brighten it up when the light's not necessarily there. It's something that the camera's doing. The problem with that, when you crank it up, is you start to get noise. So everyone's seen like old, Kodak pictures. They used to like, crank the deal and then shoot one, and you had 10 pictures, you have to get it developed. Those are very noisy images. The same will happen if your ISO is set really, really high, because I'm not going to get into the technical stuff. Just keep the ISO as low as you can. Put it on auto. If you're in low light, then you might have to control it, but keep it as low as possible, because you'll get a really noisy, grainy, weird image. If you're going for the clear stuff, that's not what you want. So that's ISO. Then f-stop, and then f-stop's also called aperture. When it comes to camera settings, white balance, I would just have it auto. What else, AJ?
You've kind of got me running everything in auto right now, except for the f-stop.
Yeah, and I think that, and you can do that. Like on a Sony, you can put it to like where you're filming video and it's in aperture priority, so then everything else will be auto, and you can just control the aperture. That's a good way to start. What I would do, like talking to you the other day, do that, and then like with video, I would do that. With pictures, it's like go to shutter speed, mess with that, and then like learn what each one does, and then you can shoot in like full manual.
Yep.
The other thing is shutter speed. So this is another kind of subject that we've been over, because he had a little bit of problems with that. So this is the most simple way to explain it, where I don't talk the whole night. With shutter speed, you want it double your frame rate. So if you're shooting in 30 frames per second, you want it to be you want your shutter speed to be 1/60. If you're shooting in 60 frames per second, you want it 1/120, or as close as you can get to that. They're not always like that. Sometimes it's a number really close. So 1/double your frame rate. That will give you natural motion blur. The problem with that sometimes, like I was telling AJ, is filming in really bright light. Sometimes the image is so blown out, like it's so bright because there's so much light going into the camera. So then people were having problems with that. A guy messaging me like a week ago on that. So that's when you need to introduce it's called an ND filter, a neutral density filter. And there's different stops of basically how much light that filter lets into the lens. And then you can play around with those. With AJ, I was just telling him, like, turn it to 4K at 60. and let it do its thing. Because for some reason, I don't know why, it just doesn't have that problem when you shoot in higher frame rates.
And it was like landing at like 125 ish, you know, so it was almost double what it was. So it was like pretty dang close to what it needed to be. But yeah, it's weird. I mean, anytime I didn't have it that way, I screwed up one whole day of filming, and I had it in what we shoot our podcast in, and got back and was just like, I called Brent immediately. I put it on my computer. I was like, what happened? And he was like, well, what are your settings at? And I was like, that's where it's wrong.
Yeah. So like shutter speed in video, it'd be like, if you're watching this on YouTube, it's like watching my hand move. People don't like know this, but there should be some blur to it. But when your shutter speed's wrong, it's like real glitchy. Like it doesn't look natural to the human eye. So that's why if you put it to double your frame rate, it will look natural. That's like the most cinematic way you can do it. What are the other settings? Make sure your autofocus, continuous autofocus is turned on.
Yep.
Wide range on your whatever brand you're shooting on. Make it as wide a map as you can, and continuous autofocus. That's what I do.
Yep. Some of the beginner things that helped me once. I mean, I don't have any of the settings right still, but like if someone's like jumping off a rock and it's closer to you, or even like doing a reentry closer to you, and you have your camera and you're not like tracking them coming up to where you're focused on them, and make sure you're like focusing, making sure it stays on them. But like a lot of times I would like end up focusing on the trees in the background, and then those are perfectly in focus, but not the rider that was, you know, right in front of me. So then all of a sudden your camera like does the shift once they're like doing what they're doing, and that really makes it really hard to edit, and you get frustrated really fast.
When things aren't in focus, dude, it's a killer. It doesn't matter what settings you have on, you know, if it's not in focus, everything goes to crap.
Yep.
So that's kind of my 2 cents. Is there anything that I should talk? I mean, was that way too complicated?
I mean, it'd be very hard to follow, but I think for some of these people, if you have a better understanding, like I've learned a little bit with the camera, if you can get yourself familiar with the camera, I think I could follow what you said there. So,
yeah. And so take each piece that I just talked about, and you can pause it and then go look up like a definition of what it is on your camera. Cause I mean, I can't sit here with every camera that you guys might own and go over like, this is f-stop on this camera, this is ISO on this camera. So just look at the main things, like learn f-stop or aperture, it's called. Learn ISO, learn shutter speed, learn frame rates and resolution pretty much, and run auto and the other ones. That's what I'd recommend.
Yeah, and I mean, I've never ran anything but the Sony, but just kind of throwing that out there. We run all Sonys in this whole group. And I mean,
all my stuff is Sony.
Everything's on a tunnel bag, and it's, I mean, they've held up really, really well.
They've held up actually really well.
Yeah.
Think about the whoops down the trail. Those things are just taking a beating.
This year's been brutal.
Yeah.
So, no, it's very impressive how the Sony's held up. And for you guys that are looking for like a beginner camera like I did, I'm running this Sony A7S4. A7 IV. And so the cool thing about it, and this is something to think about, is it's got a trigger on it to where I can go like video and be videoing, and then they flip around to hit it again or something. I can just boop to pictures, and then if I have my settings close to being ready, right, I can go to pictures and take pictures right away too. So that's something really in the snowmobile thing, you know, because you go up, you do a reentry, you come back, you do another one, whatever. If you want to do picture, video, back and forth, it's definitely really nice having that setting to go back and forth between the two really quick.
Yeah. And we've been mainly talking about bodies. The other thing I'll touch on real quick is lenses. So if you have a tight budget, it's really hard to like get a body. Like say you had $1,000 to spend. Well, you could with $1,000 actually, now that I think about it, but you just save your money. Like if you have $500 to spend on a camera, my opinion is just like shoot on the iPhone for a while and save up some money. Yeah. So the lenses that I carry with me, I have like shooting in the summer, shooting wildlife and stuff. I have different lenses, obviously, but the two lenses that never stay at home when it comes to snowmobiling is a Sony. All my lenses are Sony. All my bodies are Sony. I think the autofocus just works better when you run native lenses to the body. So I'll have like what I carry, the two lenses that I carry, sorry, is a 16-35 f2.8 G Master. That's what I do. Like if we're in the truck, if we're vlogging, if we're like, that's the lens that's on the camera right now. That's like my workhorse. That's the one I use 90% of the time for everything. And then the other one that I use if we're going to like, you know, big jumps or whatever, and I need to be kind of out of the way, not really close to the subject, then I'll use a 70-200 f2.8 G Master, and that's the Mark II. It's light. It's a big lens, but with a camera set up on the back, it's not that bad. And those are the two lenses that I have. You got kind of all ranges that you need for snowmobiling there. The middle you don't really have. Like AJ's is if I could only have one lens, it'd be AJ's, because you could do. It wouldn't be ideal for either, but it's great for everything.
Yeah, I can shoot a lot of stuff on that lens that I have. You know, it's been very convenient for me, just like learning, not having to like, what lens do I put on? You know, like this is the one lens I can shoot a huge range of stuff, and it's been really convenient for that.
Yeah, and what I love about that lens is it's got the stabilization in the lens.
Yep.
So that's another thing in bodies. Stabilization's huge. I love it. And then like my lens is the one that's on the camera right now that I use all the time. It's not stabilized. The 70-200 is stabilized. So if we're not really close, like basically like talking stuff or like tutorials or something like that, 70-200 is my go-to. And if I'm too close, I'll just back up, because I just love the way that lens looks, and it's a good range in my opinion.
Yep. No, and we kind of got spoiled this year. Just yesterday, even we had your lens for shooting far away, and then I had mine out running it right next to it just in case you came closer, and we're able to hit both really good that way.
Yeah. So. But just get out there and practice, guys. Like, the biggest thing is, you know, like we were talking about, AJ spoke on, no one's really covering camera stuff for snowmobilers because it's such like a niche down thing. There's just not a lot of views to be had, like probably this podcast right now, but it is a different thing. Like when you're shooting action sports, especially snowmobiling with snow everywhere, trees everywhere, it's pretty hard to shoot, especially on a camera. So just go out and practice, mess with settings. Something that you can do too, like to understand settings, is like put a water bottle on the table and just mess around with pictures and crank your aperture and see how it looks different. But there's all kinds of stuff. There's a ton of resources on YouTube. I mean, that's how I learned. I graduated from YouTube University, YouTube Camera University. But yeah, just keep trying and keep doing it. Don't get frustrated, because if you have a decent camera, you'd be amazed what you could do with it. Like, some of these people are shooting on really cheap rigs, and they're getting like the most insane shots ever.
Yeah. Well, and you can't be afraid to change your settings and mess with your settings, because what I found was like, I was like, here, Brent, just set this up and then I'll go film with it. That's not possible. I found out, like, you have to know how to run your camera, and you have to know how to change the settings for every day and every situation, because it changes every single time. There's no such thing as one, you know, cookie cutter, this fits everything. So you have to play with your camera and see what is going to work for it.
Yeah, iPhone is the only thing that works for everything, it seems like. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, iPhones are great, but in my opinion, they can't, when it comes to shooting something like snowmobiles, they can't even touch one of these cameras. Just, you don't have the versatility of zoom. If you zoom, it's all blurry. You need something that can kind of crop in better, and the cameras with, you know, different setups of lenses is definitely the way to go, in my opinion. It's an expensive way to go, but if you love it like we do, it's worth it.
The quality's worth it for sure.
Yeah. And then, I mean, you might find a huge passion in cameras and, you know, content, and then it's all worth it. So that's kind of all I have to say. If you guys have questions, leave them in the comments. DM me on Instagram at cook.bros, and I'll try to help you. Everyone that's been DMing me on Instagram about camera stuff, I've been trying to make the most amount of sense as I can. But yeah, it's just one of those things you got to practice. It's like asking somebody how to go out and hit a 70-yard jump. It's like, well, you just have to practice and like understand what you're doing. And that's the same with cameras. It's kind of an art to it. So don't get discouraged. Hang in there. Let her eat. And till next time. Yeah, we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for tuning in. Like, subscribe, follow, and we'll see you on next week's episode. Yeah. DM on Cook Bros if you have any questions. Later. Peace. Yeah.